Welcome everyone to this intellectual journey. My name is Ricardo Ibáñez, and this is another episode of RICARDO'S, an educational program of the Objectivist philosophy. Today I'm interviewing Shoshana Milgram. She's a professor of literature and an objectivist. Her long-term study of the life of Ayn Rand involves the examination of text. Welcome, Shoshana. Thanks for being with us. All right, Shoshana, I would like to start by asking you, when do you discover Ayn Rand?
Okay, well, I discovered Ayn Rand at a very good time to read Ayn Rand, which was my first year of college. And I was at Barnard College of Columbia University in New York. And actually, Ayn Rand was still alive at the time and living in New York, although I didn't know that for a while. And what happened was that it was recommended to me to read The Fountainhead. And I read it, and I was very impressed by it. I was very impressed by it as a work of literature. And at that time, I was specializing in 19th century novels and in Russian novels and French novels and so on. And her book reminded me of what I liked best about the novels I already loved. Because as compared with other writers in English, her writing was dramatic and heroic, and as compared with a lot of other writers in the 20th century, her writing had a very strong plot and an exciting integration of the plot and the theme. So when I read this, I enjoyed it, and I also noticed that it was an American setting, a very interesting American setting, but it felt very much like the literature I already loved. And one of the things I noticed about it, because I took notes on it while I was reading it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed this, but it is a novel that, unlike some of her others, is set in a particular time and place. And if you keep track of what year it is, because she's relating the architectural careers of her characters to actual architectural movements and Henry Cameron's career, if you keep track of the years and of how old the characters are, then you see that Howard Rourke is smack with the century. So he's born in 1900. So if you know how old Howard Rourke is, you know what year it is in the book. If you know what year it is in the book, you know how old Howard Rourke is. And I thought that was very clever as a way of helping you see where you are in the book without a lot of reminders. And I really loved the book. I also found the theme to be very inspiring, the individualism, the emphasis on guiding your own life, choosing your own life, shaping your own life.
Right.
Now, at the time, I already had a copy of We the Living, which had to do with my interest in Russian, but I hadn't read it yet. I read The Fountainhead, and I really enjoyed it. But it was also a book that, took time and concentration to read. And so I decided that I would continue reading her long books later. But during the same year, my first year in college, I met some objectivists. And at the time, when Ayn Rand was alive, we talked about students of objectivism because she was the articulator of the philosophy and other people were learning. But students of objectivism, people who were advocates for her philosophy, and I went to some recorded lectures of her Forward Hall Forum talks. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who were at that table with me, I still know. People that I knew many years ago, I still know. And at the time, I had no context. And I didn't understand what united the various points she was making. I could see that her outlook was very different from what I heard from other people or what I read in the New York Times, but I didn't understand the principles. And I thought, well, when I read more,
right,
I'll learn more. But I decided that I was going to get my ideas from her directly rather than asking other people. Mm-hmm. And this was also a time when, we didn't have Google, we didn't have the internet. And so the next stage was that at the end of the year, the end of my freshman year, I got a copy of Atlas Shrugged. I took my last exams. I went home. I started reading Atlas Shrugged. 2 days later, I was done. Now, I guess I must have not slept. I don't remember much of those 2 days, except that I read Atlas Shrugged, and I read everything. I didn't skip the speech. I was very interested, but I was very, very impressed by it. And I then immediately started reading it over again. And I've been rereading it ever since. Also, that summer, I went to summer school at Harvard, and Harvard has a very good library. And I used the opportunity of being in a very good library to not only read it, whatever I could read by Ayn Rand that I couldn't buy, but also to read what other people had to say. And this was a very good education in looking at reviews and criticism, because I could see many people did not understand her books. They were simply wrong. And that led me to be careful ever after with reading what other people had to say, because I could read with my own eyes and I could see when they were inaccurate. So I read Fountainhead, I read Atlas Shrugged, I read the nonfiction as it existed at that time, I read criticism, and then Ayn Rand kept writing more books because she was still alive. And I went to hear her at Ford Hall Forum, and she gave the lecture she gave at Ford Hall Forum also in New York that year. And then later books were coming out, and The Objectivist was coming out, and I've been keeping up ever since. So initially, I just admired the Fountainhead very much. And then I went on to read her other books and to admire her work and her ideas.
Mm-hmm. So you knew Ayn Rand personally at that time?
I wouldn't say that I knew her personally. I knew she was in New York, but she was a busy person, and I was busy too. I was a student, but I did go to hear her speak, but I didn't, I thought she was going to live forever. And so I did not, I thought that when I finished my studies, I will write to her. And in fact, I should have done that when I finished my PhD, but I didn't. Mm-hmm. And I wish I had been in touch with her, but I met her once only in person at a Ford Hall Forum where she'd spoken about Israel and commented that she was a supporter of Israel. And so I went up afterwards, and I had a button in favor of Israel, and I offered it to her. I thought maybe she wants a button, and she very kindly said no, I should keep my button, and that she didn't want to wear a button, but she appreciated the thought. So that was, she was polite, but she did not want my button.
Right.
But I obviously thought that there would be time in the years ahead to make contact with her, which I wish there had been. Instead, I've made contact with her writing and with everything about her that I can find. And sometimes, actually, it almost feels to me as if I have gotten to know her personally, because when I read her papers, I'm living her life moment by moment. And I look at her day calendar. I know what she did in the morning. And by the way, when you were talking about my work, 1957 is the publication of Atlas Shrugged, and that's the end point of this volume. And I start with her birth and 1905, although you could say that in fact she was born as a writer in 1914, because that was when she decided to become a writer. And that's when she discovered Cyrus as a literary hero, and she discovered that she was a good storyteller, and that was her birth as a writer. But and in a way, that's the beginning of the story, but I don't leave out her childhood.
Right.
But I feel as if I knew her personally in some ways, although, you know, there's always a sense in which there's something private about a person that no one knows. Mm-hmm. And it's also true that when I look at her life over time, I can see some things about it that perhaps she herself would not have seen, because, as you know, in your own life, what were you doing 5 years ago? Mm-hmm. Today? You don't know. But if I look at Ayn Rand's calendar, I can see what she was doing 5 years ago, what she was reading 5 years ago, and I can put her story together as she actually lived it.
Wow. So you look really passionate about research. Why do you enjoy this specific type of research? Is there any reason?
I like different kinds of research. I'm most interested in firsthand research, mm-hmm. You know, and what other people say or what other people noticed is one thing, but there's always a question about it. Were they good observers? Are they good writers? Are they accurate? What do they remember? And so I really like firsthand information the best. Okay. And part of that with Ayn Rand, you see, is that we do have the drafts of most of her writing. We have an enormous number of letters. We have, I know books that she read, and so even if she didn't make notes in the books, I can read them, and I can say, well, she read this. Mm-hmm. how is this a book that would have had meaning for her in view of other things I know about her? So yeah, I do like doing research because part of being in literature is that you like to read and you like the words, and so that's always been interesting to me.
Now, I know you have studied Russian. Is it because you wanted to read Ayn Rand's writings in Russian?
Sure. Well, the interesting thing is that I was already majoring in Russian before I got interested in Ayn Rand. And that came about because when I was in high school, I went to a poetry reading by the poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko. And I loved listening to him read. I loved the sound of the language. And I already knew French. I knew Hebrew. I knew Latin. I didn't know any Russian. I thought, I'll learn some Russian and see how it is. And when I was in high school, it was possible to take a course at a local college. Just you could do that without leaving high school. And so I took first year Russian. And through first year Russian and doing my own reading, I thought this really is a very powerful language, and it will allow me to read writers who are interesting to me. Now, I didn't know anything about Ayn Rand, but I knew Dostoevsky. And reading Russian allowed me to read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and so on. And when I went to college, I knew that I wanted to do several literatures, but I'd already had several years of French and I could read French. I took some courses. British and American, I was finding my way in. I could do some of that on my own. And I took courses. But Russian, I had needed to catch up on because I had just started Russian. So that made Russian a very good major for me because it was a very fine department. The Barnard, which was the women's college, and it was separate from Columbia on the other side of the street, the men's college. But Barnard, Columbia had the same Russian department because our courses their offices were on different sides of the street, but the courses were open to us on both sides. And so I had some wonderful, wonderful, inspiring professors. I had full courses, semester course on Pushkin, Tolstoy, Gogol. It was a very, very good choice for me. And during that time, I was interested in Russian history and culture, and that's how, as a freshman, I managed to get a copy of We the Living, but I had not read it yet. And then I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and went back and read We the Living. And of course, that was interesting to me because by the time I read We the Living, I knew more than Ayn Rand knew at the time about everything about her and the values that were important. And yet you can see that her values are implicit and some places explicit in We the Living. So that was very
that's a really
interesting to me. So the question of reading in Russian, the way this showed up in terms of studying Ayn Rand for me is that, of course, I could read her own Russian writings in Russian. Now, Dina Schein-Federman translated those, and it's published in a book called Russian Writings on Hollywood by Ayn Rand, and her translations are good, but I can read the Russian. It's published in facsimile there, and for me, that's exciting because that's her first style. This is the way that she thought and wrote when she was a teenager.
Right.
Barely out of her teens. And in addition to that, when she came to the United States, she wrote letters back to her family. Now, the letters she wrote to her family, they went to Russia, the letters did, and we don't know where they are now. I still hope they might turn up someday, but no. However, the letters that they wrote to her, she kept them for her whole life. And Dina, who was, native speaker and reader of Russian, Dina translated those letters, but I can also read them myself, which is good because it's just interesting. Sometimes what her family did in their letters is that they would quote from her letters to them. So it's as if I've got an indirect view to what she would have written to them. So it's an advantage to me to be able to read the Russian. It also helped me when I went in search of what I believe to be her philosophy textbook when she was in college, because she had described it, she hadn't named it, and that was research for me. I knew something about the textbook, and I looked for all the possible textbooks that could have been published in time for her to study them at the university when she was there, and there was really only one that seemed suitable, that matched her description, and I got a copy of that, and I can read that. Now, I can't read Russian as well as I can read English, right, but I can read it better than someone who doesn't know Russian, and I can make my way in it. I use a dictionary if I'm not sure, and that means that I don't have to depend as much as I might otherwise have to depend on secondary sources, because I can read it myself. Exactly. And that's good. And I can read French. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't read French as well as I read English, but I can read French, and Ayn Rand read French very well. She read very well, even when she was 9 years old. She was reading French very well. Those children's magazines she loved. She could read in very sophisticated French. You know, it was quite, of course, you know, she was very intelligent, but French magazines were available to kids, young people in Russia, and she took advantage of that, and she read French very well.
Mm-hmm. So I
can do that too.
Right. I think you had a really, really interesting formation, and that really helped you. You also have natural languages, and that really helped you to become like a detective in literature and in your actual work, you know, or the work of.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm interested in films as well. I mean, I teach courses in literature and film.
Right.
And I've had some publications in film, and I've done some reading. And she was in film. You know, that was how she got her start in writing, was writing about films. And when she came to the United States, that was what she told the Soviets, that she was coming to the United States in order to learn about this brand new art form and to learn how to make good films and then go back and show them how to do it. Now, of course, she did not want to go back and show them how to do it. But for her, I think she was speaking sincerely when she said this is an important art form and she wanted to be part of it. And I think she did have good ideas for films. I think that you can see that even in her fiction, that she describes scenes visually. Mm-hmm. The way that she juxtaposes scenes. Even sections in We the Living sometimes almost feel like films. She just, you know, montage. She describes this, mm-hmm. this scene as a film might. Right. So, and I can, you know, I enjoy that. I can see it. And it's also interesting to me that she started in film, and the very last writing she did was the screenplay for Atlas Shrugged.
Mm-hmm. Now, Shoshana, I know you are one of the few people that really know details about Ayn Rand's life. I would like to talk about Ayn Rand's biographies. You are working in an Ayn Rand's biography. Could you please tell me what makes it different from the existing ones?
Okay, well, it's a good question. And my first answer is actually a simple one, is that when I got interested in Ayn Rand, I went looking for a biography, and I didn't see anything like the kind of book that I would have liked to find, and that I do find for some other writers. Mm-hmm. And this, what I'm really interested in, what I like to see in a biography of a writer, is a book that makes clear who the person was who wrote those books. Okay, the life of, that it fits, that the life fits the person who wrote the books, and that it's not as if, well, here's the life of the person, and then on Saturday nights she wrote her books or something like that. But no, that you understand that this is the life of the person who wrote these books. That's who she was. And this is especially important with Ayn Rand because she tells us that her life is her work. She wrote a letter to the readers of the Fountainhead, which was published. And you can actually find it at the end of the Letters of Ayn Rand, but it was published at the time because people had questions. And she said, well, I've never had a private life in the usual sense. Everything you want to know about me is in the pages of the Fountainhead, and all I am is my work. And as she said about Rourke, you know, my work done my way. Mm-hmm. And in addition, she has the scene in the Fountainhead where Stephen Mallory and Rourke is gone in search of him to get him to do a sculpture, and Mallory can't believe that Rourke really wants to know who he is. And Rourke says, tell me about the things you really want said. Tell me what's important. Don't tell me about your friends or your family or your feelings. Tell me about the things that are important, that count. Mm-hmm. Now, I could look at that and think, okay, does that mean that friends and family and feelings and so on are not important? No, because they could be, and Ayn Rand certainly tells us about friends and family and feelings with her characters, but it does mean that if you allow anything to interfere or to make unimportant what actually is important.
Mm-hmm.
That her work done her way, then you're going off track. Now, the interesting thing with Ayn Rand is that her life is all organized around doing her work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as if somehow she was a tennis player and then she became a writer. Yeah.
Okay.
I suppose if Ayn Rand were a tennis player, maybe that would be related to her being a writer. But she always wanted to be, someone who had ideas and expressed them, even if the medium changed. She thought of doing films. She wrote fiction. She later wrote nonfiction. She gave public speeches, but it was all in the service of her presentation of what a human being ought to be, the ideal human being, and the kind of world in which that person can thrive. So it all fits together. She comes to the United States to be a writer, because if she'd stayed in Russia, tried to be a writer there, she would have been dead.
Right.
Okay. She comes to the United States and is trying to get her start working in films because she can learn about films, make a living as a writer, learn about America, and so on. She decides to write We the Living as her first novel because she had two ideas for her first novel. The other one was going to be a science fiction story, which I wish she'd had time to do that one too. But she thought, well, I know the background of We the Living well, and it fits my theme. And it turned out to be the first anti-Soviet novel in English, so it was an important, timely work. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you read it afterwards, after you've read The Fountainhead, after you've read Atlas Shrugged, you can see that it's the same writer. But this even is the way that some of the characters we know from her other books would have been if they had been in that situation. Mm-hmm. Because Russia was a place where the human ideal could not thrive. Could survive spiritually, but not existentially. So, it all fits. Why does she write plays? Well, she wrote plays because she liked plays. Plays were a way of expressing the human ideal. And also because she is a practical writer. She's not expecting the world to come knocking on her door and to give her a living. It takes a long time to write a novel. A play you can write more briefly. It's out there. It expresses your values, what you have to say. It's a real thing. It's a product. And if you're paid to do it, then you have money to do the next thing. Mm-hmm. So everything was always about being a writer, and that makes sense to me. I think that I understand how her life is oriented toward that goal of being a writer. And she talked about it as a race against time, because Atlas Shrugged, she said, was everything she wanted to do in fiction. And until she wrote that book, she couldn't rest. If a bomb were going off in the next room, she would have to keep writing. Well, hope it wouldn't be a bomb going off in the next room, but that, it's a race against time for that. And you see, I think it does mark a certain stopping point in her life, because once she'd achieved that, she did have other ideas for fiction, but she had done it all. And since the response was not what she wanted, she had other things to say that would affect readers, because some readers apparently couldn't get the book, couldn't understand the book, and needed to be reached in some other ways. I think that over time, people can understand Atlas Shrugged without the nonfiction. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's actually necessary. It's not like special features on the DVD or something that tell you something you wouldn't otherwise know. Mm-hmm. But it's also true that the nonfiction goes together, which is one reason why often in her nonfiction, she's talking about her fictional characters and quoting them, because they're all part of the same world. Right. So my story is about her as a writer. I've got some background, I've got some skills, and I'm willing to do the work to read what she wrote, see what she saw, learn what she knew, follow up in libraries all over the world on information that would illuminate what we have. Because the Ayn Rand Archives in California, great place, wonderful stuff there. But the Ayn Rand papers, the holdings there are just what Ayn Rand herself had at the end of her life. And so, for example, if there are records of her work elsewhere that she didn't herself have, Well, they might have been collected by the special collections area in the archives, or I might have to go find them somewhere else. And if I find out about them, I will. Whenever I hear of something that leads me to think I'm going to find more Ayn Rand there, then I look into it. Joan Kennedy Taylor was an associate of Ayn Rand's in the years of the Objectivist. She was the editor of Persuasion, and which Ayn Rand endorsed, and she was, on good terms with Ayn Rand for some long period of time. Well, I found out in a biography of Joan Kennedy Taylor that she'd written an essay for possible publication in The Objectivist, and that Ayn Rand had returned it to her with comments. Well, since it wasn't published in The Objectivist, and I didn't have a copy of it anywhere else, but I heard that, well, there were comments, I thought, well, let me see if I can find these. And Joan Kennedy Taylor's papers were in an archive. And I couldn't actually go out there, but I hired someone to go out and look and make copies for me. And when I saw the handwriting, I knew that handwriting. And so, it all fit together. Now you could say, by the way, how does that fit into Ayn Rand being a writer? Well, she was in some years, she was also a publisher. She was an editor and a publisher. And part of that work was having other people whom she could endorse. And she did stand behind everything in her own publications. And so part of what we see there in her comments on someone else's writing is what it meant for something to be published in that publication. That it was that Ayn Rand herself had sometimes contributed to it or stopped something from being published that didn't belong. So that was, to me, that was a very interesting story. Now that's after 1957, but it's interesting and it's part of the same story. And I do expect that it will not take me as long to write more after I get this. This has taken a long time, but I think I now know enough that I can do more of it later on. Mm-hmm. So, but essentially it's the focus on Ayn Rand as who she was as a writer, when she wrote, how she wrote, why she wrote, and how we can see her in the act of writing. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so interesting to me to look at her drafts, even though she tore up pages and the drafts are not complete. She didn't keep everything, but in what she has there in alternative versions, I've got plans, I've got some notion of what the process was, including when she wrote what she wrote. I can correlate it with her life experience. It was, it's interesting, for example, that the second part of Atlas Shrugged, where I don't want to spoil this for people who don't know too much, but the second part of Atlas Shrugged is very exciting, and something very exciting is happening. Very exciting. Okay, and when Ayn Rand was writing that, she was very much absorbed with that, and she said it was hard for her to think of anything in the real world, meaning the world. Well, it was sort of as if this was the real world and anything outside that wasn't the real world to her at that time. And she even said that she was not going to leave California and move to New York until she got that part done. Mm. So it's as if her writing circumstances and her being in California and her having to get to that point in the book. She used to say that when she was writing, it was as if the characters from the book were house guests for her and Frank, and that after they left, it was as if you had to get used to being in the house by yourself without your house guests, as if the characters were real people to her. So I think the writing, it's not just a metaphor, that her life is about the writing, as it was for Rourke. I mean, how would you tell the story of Rourke's life without his buildings? Now, there are other things going on in the Fountainhead other than the buildings, but in a sense, they're all related, including Dominique, who doesn't get her own section, but she's a kind of audience for learning what one needs to learn from the story of Rourke, that he can win, existentially and spiritually. And that's part of Rourke's story. The buildings can go up, and that's why the ending is so glorious, that Dominique is going up the elevator to the top of the building with him. And as indeed you could say, Frank O'Connor is always, he was actually the side of Dominique that was something like Frank O'Connor, but he also was part of her story and going up to the top with her, which is why she said, she called her books her temples to him.
Perfect. Let's move ahead. So there is a quote that says, "True philosophers are those who teach but what they do, and especially but what they are, much more than but what they say or write." The question is, what findings do you see about the personal life of Ayn Rand that shows how Ayn Rand did not only say or write extraordinary, but she also was a person who acted according to what she preached?
Okay, well, it's an interesting language there, because I guess the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm not sure that Ayn Rand would necessarily have thought of herself as preaching or teaching anything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, not just that preach has a religious connotation, but she also used to say that her books weren't about teaching. She said, "I'm not writing to teach, sell, or destroy anything. I write for the sake of the story, for living in a world that I want to live in. The goal of my writing is to project a human ideal." Now, you could say that when she's writing nonfiction, that there's a sense in which that was more for other, it was for other people in a way that writing her fiction was not, but it was still related to the overall goal. So if anything, maybe you could say she's teaching when she's writing her nonfiction, but preaching in the sense of telling people what to do. No, whether she understands certain things about the world, she's willing to share what she's learned. Mm-hmm. If you find that persuasive and convincing, then you can go along with it. I love the way that she used to talk to students. She said, well, study, ask questions. If you want to, you can learn more about my ideas. And if so, if you come to agree with me, let us save the world together. We still have time, but I think that it's not the sense of agree with me or else, but more like, well, this is something I understand. Mm-hmm. And as one would in the classroom, this is something I understand. And if you want to understand it too, you should understand it too. Now, I think that part of your question, though, has to do with, is she the person who lives the life, is she the same as the person who writes the books? And see, that's my whole focus, that this is the same person. And everything in her life is connected to that purpose, in the sense that she's like Howard Roark, she's dedicated to her work. And I keep coming back to The Fountainhead because even though Atlas Shrugged is a longer book, it's a deeper book, and in some respects it has some virtues that we don't quite see in full in The Fountainhead. But The Fountainhead is an excellent book, and it's a very good book, I think, for understanding Ayn Rand. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of it is her story. Okay, it's her story. Now, she doesn't start out naked on a cliff. She doesn't have red hair, and she didn't build buildings, but she built books, and she built books by her own plans, and she had her own rules, and she knew what she wanted, and she didn't know everything immediately any more than Roark did. Okay, and if Roark studies with Cameron and learns from him, well, she can study from her reading of other people. She can learn things from Victor Hugo, whom she admires, but she doesn't want to imitate Victor Hugo. She doesn't want to just copy him. She wants to write her own books. And nothing can make it worth it to her to give up on what matters to her. That's very vivid to her, that the book has to be her writing has to be all of a piece. So, that's Ayn Rand. I mean, if somehow I found out that she agreed to have someone make a change in something she wrote that she didn't agree with, that would be untrue to Ayn Rand. But that didn't happen. And from her youth to all the way, I mean, there are a lot of good stories about the way that she insisted on the integrity of her work, especially when it counted. When it came to her first play that was produced on Broadway, there were a lot of experts telling her that they knew better. And she said, well, you just need to give me the reasons. Give me your reasons. I'll take advice from the night watchman if I have reasons. But she didn't want people making changes without reasons. And unfortunately, because when she started, she got very good legal advice later, but she didn't have the appropriate protective advice to keep out the interferences. And so the story of 9 January 16th had some problems, and later on she had to bring out the 1968 version the way she wanted it. Mm-hmm. And I think that her experience with 9 January 16th made it very vivid to her of what can happen if other people get their grubby paws on your writing and make a mess of it. So she was not going to let, that was not going to happen again. And in The Fountainhead, well, it happens to Rourke, and you see how he feels about that and what he does about that. You know, that she made that a dramatic subject in there that's very true to her own experience. Now, sometimes people wonder about the film of The Fountainhead and say, well, you know, it's the film of The Fountainhead and it's not the same as the novel. Well, I actually just, I did a lecture on that a couple of years ago on why her first plan for the Fountainhead movie, and I did an interview with Ilan Giorno, should be up on ARI's site.
Yeah, I watched it.
Yeah, well, I explained there what happened, which is that she did want the Fountainhead to be out there. She thought it would increase sales of the book, and the money did give her time for the next book. And when she was having her conversations with people practically about it, and she had what she thought of as a gentleman's agreement that they were not to make changes without consulting her, and she would make changes free, but she wanted to be consulted. It didn't quite work out that way, but she did what she could to insist and to protect, especially the speech, which was most important to her. So I think that that's a case where when you look at how careful she was, and nonetheless she did learn a lesson that with the Atlas Shrugged, that was not going to happen again. That what happened with the Fountainhead, she was going to have to insist on greater control up front and not just a gentleman's agreement. Mm. So you could say that, you know, for her, it was always important to protect her writing and to protect her control over it, and that what she had to say would be what was published and presented as hers. You've probably heard the story about someone who offered her an enormous amount of money if she would just include religion. And she said, what good would all that money be to me if I had to falsify my philosophy? Who cares about that? Exactly. And, you know, it's not even a temptation. It's sort of like saying, I'll give you a lot of money if I can cut your head off. Well, what good is money going to be if you cut my head off? So, yeah, that's who she was. And that was always who she was, that it was important to her to protect the integrity of her work and the integrity of her name. So yeah, that was who she was. That was always who she was.
Wow, amazing story. So we already talked about her novels. Would you like to add something? I know one of her books placed second as the most influential book in American's life. Could you comment on that, please?
What I always figure anyway is that these are not matters really for polls. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that the quality of the book of her books, which I think is clear on the basis of the books themselves, mm-hmm. Is more important than a poll or than even the shifting sands of her reputation. Now, there are a number of things one can say. One can say that she's got suspenseful plots, that she has plots that are integrated with original themes, that she has colorful characters, that she can write scenes, she can write dialogue, she can write descriptions. All those technical things that the 19th century writers, the good ones, did well, she can do those, and she can do them superlatively. And in point of fact, you can take passages out of her books and show them to people who don't know what they are, and they'll say, well, that's really wonderful. Who wrote that? And then they find out it's Ayn Rand, whom they haven't read. They might be a little surprised about that. So I think that just on a purely technical level, wonderful. When we add to that she has original themes, and that her philosophy is true, that puts her in a unique category. And then to add to that I sometimes when I'm analyzing literature, I talk about three things. I talk about intensity, and I talk about scale or scope, and about integration. So intensity is just the, strong emotional concentration, moment by moment. She's very good at that. As a matter of fact, you really need to pay attention in her books. When my students tell me that they try to skim, it doesn't work. They've got to stay with it. So she's wonderful at intensity. And as far as scale and scope, she writes about the subjects that have the greatest possible universal relevance. And integration is one of her great strengths because everything is connected with everything else.
Yeah, that's
Put
really...
down your finger here, and how is this connected to something else in the book? Well, look at the beginning, look at the end. You can see how, because in fact, she didn't just figure out how to end her book when she got to the end. She knew what the ending was going to be before she started. So, and that's one of the reasons why it took a lot out of her to write Atlas Shrugged, because she was working on several planes at once. The plot and the book.
Right? I think 13 years she wrote.
Yeah, there's that, but it also, when she was working on it, it was hard work, she said, very tiring. And Atlas, the Galt speech was especially tiring. Well, that was a special kind of mission, but it was very, very intense work. So she's got the intensity, she's got the scale, she's got the integration, she's got the plots and the themes and the characters and the descriptions and and the scenes and the originality. Now, to add to all of that, and I think that it's important from the standpoint of the integration. Other writers who were excellent in some of the different categories, there are often, at some level, inconsistencies. A character will do something that isn't quite true to that character's values, or what's this episode doing here? Or how does this all add up? Or where is the story going at this point? And when you have those inconsistencies, sometimes it means that maybe you as a reader are not paying attention and you need to figure out the answer to your own question. Or sometimes it's because the writer didn't quite do a great job of putting everything together. Or if the moral theme is one that is not a correct version of morality, the inconsistencies can come in because we've got an admirable character who is allegedly admirable character who is doing something that actually is not, from a rational standpoint, moral, and there's a problem, or the other way around. So there are various opportunities for the writer to lose you, and readers check out, I don't get it. Something doesn't compute here. Well, with Ayn Rand, if you're paying attention, that's not going to happen. It's all a whole. And that's why people think of it as a world you're invited into. It's a world you go into in which everything fits together and you want to stay there. And so, well, you have to be willing to pay attention, and you need to be willing to ask questions and to think about what you're reading, and not to read it through some secondary source that told you something that wasn't true. But I think that her novels really are unique in that sense that it's a consistently integrated universe. And I could also say that that her books often strike people as both, I never saw anything like that before, and that's always what I thought. And those two reactions seem to be contradictory, but I think what it comes down to is I never thought of it in that way before, but I've been working toward it to the extent that, as people are living healthy lives, they are working toward rational values. And now they see the whole picture together, just as never before. So I think her books are wonderful. Now, the question about other people and so on, well, back when I was in between my freshman and my sophomore year, when I read what other people had to say about her books, I thought, okay, well, what do they know? And they don't know how to read. And I think sometimes people don't know how to read. They don't know how to read for themselves, or they don't know how to read in full, or they don't know how to read, through material that might be challenging. I don't think you need to be a philosopher to read Ayn Rand, even though she writes philosophical novels, but you do need to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, I'm just going to sort of throw this out as an example, which maybe will make sense to people, and I'll try to do it without spoilers. Okay. She wrote a play called Think Twice. It's a mystery play, so I can't tell you how it works out. And it was not actually, it had some bites, but it was not produced in her lifetime. Mm-hmm. However, this is a play, a little over 100 pages that if students read this, they can understand many ideas of Ayn Rand's and values of Ayn Rand's just from the way that the story develops. Who gets killed? Why? What do we think about the various people in the story? And you don't need to have read Ayn Rand beforehand in order to learn something. And yet, when you get to the end, it all makes sense. Now, it's not, well, as with other things, don't try this at home. The events in the story are not necessarily the way anybody would want to. It's not realistic, but it's not fantasy either. It's stylized. And I think that's a work that if people can understand that, and they can, I've done that with students, they should be able to understand the other books too if they just give them enough time. Now, people seem to be able to read Think Twice and make sense out of it because it's a mystery and they want to know. And of course, Atlas Shrugged's also a mystery, but it takes a lot longer. It's a lot longer, and so you need patience and you need to stay with it. But things can be worth reading that require patience. It's not as if all values have to be the attention span of an ant. I don't know what attention span ants have, but you need to have some attention span in order to read the books, because the books are, well, they're like human lives. You didn't just get here on Monday, and on Tuesday you don't forget what you did on Monday. Your life is a continuous whole. The books are continuous wholes. It's a disability to not be able to make connections from one day to the next, or it's a kind of a reading impairment not to be able to make connections from one chapter to the next. You need to think about it. You need to have an active mind. So I think if people have active minds, they will enjoy her books. And my own students, the ones who were the people who like to read, they generally are very happy when they find Ayn Rand. And they didn't know that they could enjoy reading a book this much. So that's kind of what I think about her, the question of her readership over time.
Yeah. I also found Ayn Rand when I was a student. And by the way, there are translations of Ayn Rand's work in Spanish. I think there is a new version in Spanish right now.
Right. Well, I know a little bit about translations because, I'm interested. Right. And we now have better Hebrew translations than we had before. Mm-hmm. So this is good. The earliest Hebrew translations of Atlas Shrugged would leave out big chunks of the speech. And how does that make sense? And now we've got Boaz Arad of the Ayn Rand Center in Israel has been making possible these new translations and new translations of the nonfiction as well. And so I remember what the old translations were like, and the new ones are better. And there's a new one of Anthem coming out soon. That's a fine thing. Now with the French translations, that's also sort of interesting because the very first French translations of Atlas Shrugged published it in volumes, volume 1, volume 2, and they didn't publish volume 3.
Wow.
Now there is a full translation, although it leaves out a few things as well. But what I find is that probably someone who can only read something in translation will want to be able to read it in full someday, but that it's better than nothing and it gives you a taste. It's just that it's not the equivalent. And Ayn Rand herself, by the way, did volunteer to help. She said, well, I know, if you like to run the translation by me, I know the language well enough, I can help. But they did not proceed to do that. I've seen the Russian translations. I have not checked them all. Mm-hmm. I looked at some Russian translations of the nonfiction in earlier years, and they were not perfect. Mm-hmm. And, with the nonfiction, especially, actually, nonfiction and fiction, both, you want accurate translations if you can get them.
Mhm.
I remember I met the person who did the Japanese translation of The Fountainhead, the first Japanese, and she read Ayn Rand in English, and she said, "This is a wonderful writer. Why have I never studied her in my education? Oh, and there's no translation. I will do a translation." And she was very dedicated and worked hard at it. And I think, I don't read Japanese, but I think she did a good job. When I met her in the States, and then I saw her also when I was in Japan, and we went and visited Frank Lloyd Wright things together in Japan, which was interesting because, she was interested in learning about that. But she was very dedicated and wanted to get words right. And I thought that was interesting.
Yes, because not anyone can be a translator. It's really hard to.
Yes.
Yes.
So I myself, I think, don't know the foreign languages, international languages, well enough to be a translator myself, but I probably do know them well enough to read what other people do.
Oh, okay.
And to check, although of course that'd be a big job to check them all, which I've not done.
Right. Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to say thank you so much, Shoshana, for the interview. It was an amazing interview. You know so many details about Ayn Rand's life. And I think you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I have one more thing that I want to say. I've told this story before, but I think it pertains to the question of her impact and influence and so on. What Ayn Rand used to say, quoting Victor Hugo, is that if a writer wrote for his time only, I might as well break my pen and throw it away. And by the way, I saw where she read that. She read that in a book that someone wrote on Hugo, and I saw that she underlined that and so on. So that's where she maybe she read it years ago, but she saw that, so that was cool. But I think another way to look at that is that whether something lasts or not, you can know that it ought to last. And whether it actually does or people appreciate it depends in some ways on them more than on the work. And there's a famous anecdote told by a playwright, and I've heard it about George Bernard Shaw or Oscar Wilde, but it goes like this, that the playwright has a new play opening, and someone comes up to him and says, "Well, your new play is opening. I hope it will be a success." And the playwright says, "I wrote this play. I know how good it is. I hope the audience will be a success." Okay, I hope the audience will be a success. Well, I think that's the way it is with Ayn Rand, that we can hope that the audience will be a success because her books are already. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shoshana. Talk to you soon. And this was another episode of Ricardo's Time. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on social media. Have a great day. Thank you.